everyone, this is Julia with episode number 89 of the Mixology Talk podcast. If you're in this business, soon enough things are just going to go wrong. It's just the nature of being in a bar or restaurant. Someday you're going to run out of the beer that your customer orders, or you're going to spill wine on a customer. What do? How do you assess a situation and make it right? So this week we're talking service recovery. Let's get into it.
So earlier this year, Julie and I went to the nightclub and bar show in Las Vegas, and we sat in on a really interesting seminar, and it was all about service recovery. Because as you heard Julia mention in the intro, it's going to happen. What we do on a daily basis, there's a lot of variables, and sometimes they go wrong. So how you recover in the eyes of the customer can either make or break that experience, and it's so important to get it right. So we're going to talk today a little bit about some ideas of how to look at different scenarios and assess what is the appropriate response, and just start thinking about how you guys do it in your bar or restaurant. And maybe this is a bigger conversation to have with your staff.
Yeah, I think one thing that I found really fascinating about that presentation was I'm kind of a data person. So I liked that they actually mapped it out on a axis, on a graph. They mapped out 4 different types of scenarios. So on one axis, they had severity, and the other, they had responsibility. So the scenarios that they mapped out were low severity, high responsibility. So in that case, that would be something like a long wait time for your order, or the order's wrong, something like that, all the way up to high responsibility, high severity, which, I mean, gosh, that would be something like spilling a glass of wine on someone, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we can all relate to different stories we've had in the industry of different levels of kind of scariness and severity and responsibility. And this is just a really great lens to look at what is the appropriate response.
So in terms of severity, low severity is something that's not that big of a deal. High severity is something that is a big deal. And on the other hand is responsibility. Is it your fault or is it nobody's fault? For example, if you spill a glass of wine, that's your fault. If there's a thunderstorm outside, it's going to be really hard to place the blame on you.
Right. So now that we kind of have those kind of variables and, the labels nailed down, now we can start to figure out what each quadrant means and what the perfect level of response is. So for the first little kind of quadrant, and it's kind of hard to visualize this, but first quadrant is the area of low severity and low responsibility. So the example that we talked about with this one was something happened on the way into your restaurant or bar, completely outside of your control.
Yeah, the customers, I don't know, they got splashed by a mud puddle or something.
Yeah, or got stuck in traffic. I mean, you had absolutely nothing to do with this.
And it's not that big of a deal either, but it's kind of a bummer, and your customer is grumpy.
Right. So the appropriate response is just to kind of relate to them, just to, sympathize and let them know it's going to be okay, and kind of get their mind in a better place.
Exactly. And this is something that's so central to the role of a bartender. It's being conversational, being friendly, and being a positive voice in that person's day. But it's not rolling out the red carpet.
Yeah, you're not going to buy them, their first 3 rounds of drinks, because that would be weird. That would be over the top, and it would be strange. And you're setting up a pretty terrible level of expectation from the customer as well.
Exactly. If I get used to a certain bar rolling out the red carpet every time I come in with a bad day, well, I'm going to put on a frown every time I walk in.
Well, and not only that, imagine what that's going to do for your customers. You're going to have an entire bar full of pissed off people hoping to get a free drink. So yeah, that's a whole nother conversation about
not
how
to
to
mention
use comps well.
Yeah, not to mention how expensive it is. So just don't bother comping a whole bunch of stuff in this situation. Just be a friend, be empathetic, and that's about the right level of response.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, just empathize with them. Put yourself in their shoes, relate to them, get them in a better mood, and let them enjoy their time with you. So the next kind of quadrant is low severity and high responsibility. It's not that big of a deal, but you're absolutely to blame for what's happening.
So this would be something like you forgot to fire someone's order, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, we can think of 1,000 different scenarios. And this is, to be completely honest, where most bars and restaurants kind of exist in service recovery. There is a problem, somewhat responsible for that, and we need to make that right.
But it's not that big of a deal.
Right. So now you can start to talk about what are we going to do to make this right. There's so many examples of this. For example, Julie mentioned not firing the food, or putting in the wrong temperature on a steak, or forget to put an entree in for a 4-top and 3 people have their food. One person's just kind of sitting there twiddling their thumbs. and what are you going to do to make this right?
So what would you do in that situation?
I think this is where a restaurant really needs to figure out what that scenario looks like. I think when you work in a bar or restaurant, you will see enough that you know what the appropriate response, what your manager is going to do. But I think this is a part where you should definitely figure out what the customer wants. Ask them, like, hey, or offer them some options. Like, hey, look, I know we only have 3 entrees out. It's going to be a couple more minutes for that 4th entree to come out. But in the meantime, I know I can get you out a salad real quick. So that way you can have something to eat while you and your friends are eating. Like, get a gauge for what they're looking for and kind of go from there. I think you definitely want to tell your manager and bring them up to speed so that way they can make sure that everything's taken care of. But just kind of make it right.
And it really depends what your comp policy is. And if you don't have one, then it's even more important to bring in your manager.
Right. And it's not, I mean, the appropriate response might not always be to comp something.
Yeah, if you're in a dive bar, then it might just be like, look, we're busy, hold on a minute. But if you're in a 4-star restaurant, they're going to want to make that right. Right.
And so also just kind of figure out what their timeline is, because sometimes I know a lot of restaurants like to comp dessert because it's typically a low cost item.
That's a good
and
point.
A high impact. But if somebody's running late to the airport or they have something else to do on the tail end of that, the last thing they want to do is wait 30 more minutes while everybody enjoys dessert and gets coffee and all these things. So just kind of getting a sense of what the customer is looking for.
Yeah, gauge the situation.
Right. And, definitely kind of get the manager involved or whatever it is your service recovery looks like. Just kind of go through that scenario.
That makes sense. So the next situation would be high severity, low responsibility. So an example here that I thought of is, imagine you have a couple in your restaurant and they have a big, loud, angry breakup. He storms out the door and she's sitting there holding the check, sobbing.
Yeah. And
it's so sad.
This has actually happened to me before.
Has it really?
It has. And it's terrible because it affects not only that table, but everybody around you. And how you kind of handle this as a restaurant, obviously this is not your problem, but it gives you the opportunity to really step in and shine. So this is what I call becoming the hero. So here you have the opportunity to really flip the scenario around and offer up an olive branch to what's happening. So for example, this one, you could just say, hey, look, I know you're having a bad time. She didn't actually have a purse or wallet or anything on her, so she couldn't actually pay the bill.
Oh, that's what happened in your example?
I mean, he literally left, and she was stuck there. Yeah. So we said, how about this? Why don't you obviously take care of yourself tonight, and then come back in the next couple of days, and we'll hold your tab open for you. That's not going to be the scenario with a lot of places, but...
Well, but you gave her an opportunity to save face. I mean, last thing she wants to be doing is running in the back doing dishes.
Right. And I actually don't know if anybody's ever done that.
I would really like to know if that actually happens.
Yeah. If you've ever made a customer wash dishes for you because they couldn't pay your tab, I'd love to hear about that, because we use that example a lot. We talk about it a lot in the industry, Yeah,
I mean, you hear about it, but I mean, it's got to be an insurance liability. Like if a customer goes in the back, they're washing dishes, they break a glass and they cut their hand, they're going to sue the pants off of you.
I know, right? Yeah, I never thought about that. But yeah, if you've ever had somebody do that or do manual labor for you to pay off their bill, I would love to hear about that.
Oh, yeah, I want to hear some examples.
Right. Yeah. Actually, yeah. How do you guys deal with that?
This is totally off topic.
But it's so good. I really want to hear about this.
But going back to our example.
Before we got sidetracked there.
Chris is absolutely right. Be the hero. And that does not mean, again, necessarily throwing money at the problem. That really depends on your comp policy and what your manager says. But what you can do is you can help people save face. You can call her an Uber. You could call a locksmith for the guy who locked his keys in his car. Just be helpful. If somebody's cell phones run out of battery and they're stranded, plug it in for them. There's so much you can do without costing money.
And this is really the opportunity to show that you care for them as a person. I remember one of the things that we would do at one of the restaurants I worked at was if somebody lost their phone or keys or wallet or whatever, if they came to you and said, I lost something, we would get their name and phone number down and we would look for it, obviously. But if we couldn't find it, we would call them back in a couple of days. Say, hey, you know what? We took a look around. We couldn't find your thing. Had any luck finding it? No. I'm really sorry. Good luck.
I don't know. I think that's really awesome, because if I call a restaurant and they say, yeah, sure, we'll look for it, my assumption is that they won't.
Well, and usually what happens is they'll put you on hold and say, I'll look in the office and real quick. And then that's kind of the end of the story. And they say yes or no, or we have it in the safe. But if you go take that little tiny extra step to say, you know what, give me a couple days, it might pop up and I'll give you a call, and you do, that's huge.
Even if
people
it's a
remember
no.
that.
I mean, it shows that you cared enough to follow up. I think that's a really good point.
Right. So little things like that. I mean, that didn't cost us anything, but it gave us a lot of credibility as far as, a good place to go that people really actually care and go from there. So the last example here is kind of the worst case scenario as far as it comes to bars and restaurants. This is high severity and high responsibility.
So there's this great classic story that I'm going to let Chris tell because he tells it so much better than I do, but it's the Ritz-Carlton dress story.
Yeah, this might be one of the most iconic service recovery stories out there. We have a YouTube video that we can link to.
Oh yeah, I'll throw that in the show notes. That'll be mixologytalk.com/89.
Yeah, and this is a famous story. Ritz-Carlton is absolutely famous for their service recovery. This was, I don't know if I've ever told anybody, but my first service job in the front of the house. I think I was 18 years old and...
Ritz-Carlton, really?
Yeah, absolutely. I was 18 years old and I got hired as a pool boy. And I didn't last long. I think I gave my 2 weeks notice the minute I saw what my uniform was because it was very short.
No comment.
Booty shorts were probably a bit longer than what I was wearing.
Do you have any photos?
No, there's no evidence.
Are you sure? We could totally put those in the show notes.
No, definitely no no photos. But it wasn't for me, and I quickly realized it. But I went through all the training and all that stuff. And one of the cool things they do is if you come across a guest that has a problem, any employee that works for Ritz-Carlton has a $2,000 budget to make it right. I never used it.
Wow.
It's crazy. Yeah.
I need to go into a local Ritz-Carlton and just start having a tantrum.
It's amazing. No questions asked, fix a problem. You're the first person of contact. So you own the problem. And if you can't fix it for $2,000 or you need help, then you begin to escalate it. But you have full responsibility of making sure somebody's problem is fixed. That's pretty cool. It's not for everybody. There's no way any restaurant is going to be able to do that. I mean, the Ritz-Carlton budget is very different from a restaurant or bar budget.
And their clientele is a bit different from most bars, I would imagine as well. But I think it shows that they're willing to trust their staff with making it right. Right,
exactly. And so the story that is on this YouTube video, and I'll abridge it because it's 15 to 20 minutes long, is basically this couple goes to Ritz-Carlton. I think it's in Miami. They check in for a big week of business meetings, and it's going to culminate to a big gala of their entire company, the president's there, CEO, the whole 9 yards. It's a big black and white event. So they check in and get all situated, and the lady sends her dress, which she painstakingly, picked all the accessories for, went through the whole ordeal about finding this outfit. So she sends her dress off to the dry cleaner, and long story short, it comes back and it fits a Barbie doll. They shrunk it down to nothing.
That's amazing.
Right. So I'm sure there's a bit of elaboration that goes along with that, but still, you get the...
Honey, I Shrunk the Dress.
Right. You kind of get the punchline to that one. So their service recovery for this was pretty incredible. So they contacted the general manager. He calls them up and just says, basically, I'll make it right. Don't worry about it. They get a limo. They take the wife up to Nordstrom and they pay for everything. A new dress, new accessories, hair and makeup, the whole 9 yards. And they bring her back to the hotel only hours before the gala, right? So she's getting dressed and getting all gussied up. And
Who says that?
I did. I just said gussied. I don't even know what that means. But figure out the security tag was still left on the dress. So she's going to go to this black-white event looking great, except for the giant security sticker.
I don't know. Was the security sticker black or white?
No, I don't know.
You're
actually,
totally
that's a great question.
Up. You don't know what color it was.
No, but actually I don't know. So what the general manager does is he gets a limo again, gets one of the people from Nordstrom to bring down one of the security removal devices and gets it undone and takes the security device off minutes before the ball starts. But that doesn't really kind of stop there. So then at that point, they just kind of made the scenario where it was before they got involved. So the next thing that they did was the general manager and a couple of the employees that were working with them gave her a standing ovation when she walked into the ballroom. I think that's a bit weird for myself.
I mean, just the last time you wore your ball gown, you didn't get a standing ovation. So
maybe that's it. Maybe I'm just jealous.
I think that's what it is.
Yeah, but obviously I think they kind of sized up the situation and the people they were working with, and they knew that would be appropriate. So that's kind of what they did. And this is a famous story. This guy tells it all over the world and evidently on YouTube. But that's kind of the extreme scenario of I messed up big and the repercussions are huge. So I'm going to roll out the red carpet and I'm going to make this thing right.
And I think not only did they make it right in that situation, but they tried to go above and beyond, which can be really difficult when you're in a situation where things have gone horribly awry.
Right. And I think that's something that we should keep in mind as we start to talk about service recovery, and we start to map out like, what is our response going to look like? Because if you just bring them back to the place where they started with, their expectations were met, you've kind of failed with service recovery. You really have to add that last layer of above and beyond, because you don't want the story that they tell their friends to be the story of they made it okay, or, I had this problem, and not really tell the full story of, and then this is what they did to make it right.
I can't tell you how many times I've seen, I don't know, on Yelp or even among friends, or, this horrible thing happened, and then they did this amazing thing to recover from it. And you know what? Those are 5-star reviews.
Yeah, I mean, that's where you're really going to make a fan for life. People are going to be talking about you. They're going to be spreading the word. Somebody that can pull off service recovery well and kind of flip that customer, as we often say, is they're going to do just fine.
I don't know. It seems to me if you're flipping a customer, that might be a situation you need to recover from.
They may be, yeah. And
unless you're a gymnastics bar.
Or that's kind of what they're into. You don't know.
Who knows? But to Chris's point earlier in this conversation, this really does depend on what kind of establishment you are. Are you a Michelin-starred restaurant, or are you a dive bar? You're gonna react very differently depending on what the cultural norms are of the place where you work. And so that's why you should have these conversations in advance with your management. And if it does happen, definitely call the manager. One thing that I definitely did want to highlight here is that you could be crossing the line into legal liability and like health code violations in the example of something like food poisoning or an injury on the part of the customer. You break a glass and they cut their hand, something like that. It is so important at this point that you escalate to management, because you absolutely could be running into a situation where you have a lawsuit on your hands. So make sure that management knows exactly what is happening and that you defer to them in those situations, in these high severity, high responsibility situations, because not only do you want to make sure it's dealt with correctly, but you may also want to make sure that you've got other people that know exactly what happened and helped you with the decision-making process.
Yeah, definitely want to make sure that you're kind of covering your bases and not doing more damage than good. So yeah, that's our episode on service recovery. I hope it helps, and at least start the conversation with you and your staff on, what it is that you do when you enter these scenarios and how you guys are going to recover as a team.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worthwhile to try to have these conversations in advance. Certainly, you're not going to think of every scenario ahead of time, but if you can at least start to say to your staff and say, what do we do in a low severity, low responsibility, high responsibility? If you can sort of break it into those 4 quadrants, you'd be surprised at how many scenarios that covers and how much more prepared you're going to be when the situation arises.
Yeah, and if your team all responds the exact same way, you're not going to have any surprises when something goes wrong.
Well, you might have surprises, but...
You may have surprises, but for the most part, your team is going to act all in the same way, and things are going to get better and not worse. And
exactly.
That's kind of what we really want to see, because there's been many stories and many times where I'm sure all of us can remember where we've gone through service recovery and the problem actually started to escalate. So hopefully this will kind of minimize those scenarios.
And hopefully nobody will be doing dishes.
Right. Please tell me. I want to hear what happens.
I'm really hoping somebody's done this before.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there you have it. Hopefully you don't have many situations where you need the information from this podcast, but if you do, hopefully we've given you some food for thought to make it a little bit easier to deal with. So definitely make sure you do have those conversations with your manager, or if you are a manager, have those conversations with your staff. You'll feel much better prepared if and when this sort of situation arises. As always, you can catch the show notes at mixologytalk.com/89. By the way, if you're enjoying this podcast, it would really mean a lot to us if you'd go on iTunes and leave a review. It helps more people find our podcast, and it helps us feel a little bit better about ourselves. Hey, let's be honest. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you again in a couple weeks. Cheers! Never miss an episode by subscribing in iTunes or YouTube. And as always, check out the show notes by clicking on the right.